A fortune in pirate gold was found after 300 years. This is the true story of a 17th-century loot discovery with a dark secret. You will learn the full, chilling narrative of greed and consequence that archaeologists pieced together from the ocean floor. We will examine the cursed objects they uncovered and ask why the crew that buried this treasure never returned for it. What price would you pay for a chest of stolen gold? To understand a treasure, you must first understand the world that created it. The late 1600s were not just a time of pirates, they were a perfect storm of opportunity, greed, and lawlessness that historians call the Golden Age of Piracy. Picture the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic coast of the Americas, not as the tranquil vacation spots we know today, but as a vast, watery highway of unimaginable wealth. This was the Spanish Main, a network of sea lanes choked with treasure fleets. Enormous Spanish galleons, floating fortresses, would lumber their way back to Europe, their holds groaning under the weight of silver bars mined by enslaved indigenous people in Potosi, gold artifacts plundered from empires, and chests filled with Colombian emeralds. This concentrated flow of riches was an irresistible target. Into this chaos sailed men who became legends. There was Henry Morgan, less a pirate and more a state-sanctioned privateer for England, leading brutal raids on Spanish ports with a letter from the king in his pocket. Later came the terrifying figure of Blackbeard, who wove slow-burning fuses into his beard to wreathe himself in smoke during battle, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. And figures like Bartholomew Roberts, the so-called Black Bart, who captured hundreds of ships and lived by a strict pirate code. These were not isolated criminals, they were entrepreneurs of plunder, operating in a time when European empires were too busy fighting each other to fully police the seas. The ports were rough, the laws were weak, and a skilled captain with a fast ship and a loyal crew could seize a fortune in a single afternoon. This was the essential ingredient, the fertile ground that made burying treasure not just a romantic fantasy, but a practical, often necessary act. A massive haul was too hot to spend all at once, and too dangerous to keep on a ship that could be captured or sunk in the next battle. So the loot went into the ground with a map and a promise to return. But as we will see, the ocean keeps its secrets well, and the promise of return is often broken by the harsh realities of a pirate's life. 3 centuries of silence were broken on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. Off the coast of a small, windswept island in the Caribbean, a local fisherman named Miguel was hauling in his nets, expecting the usual catch of snapper and grouper. Instead, his hands met the heavy, unnatural weight of something that was not a fish. He pulled it aboard, a lump of rock and ocean growth, and with a curious tap of his knife, a chunk of the crust fell away. Beneath the grime, a soft, unmistakable gleam of silver caught the morning sun. It was a coin, thick and heavy, its surface worn smooth by the sea, but still bearing the faint, regal profile of a Spanish king. Miguel stared, his mind racing through stories his own grandfather had told, legends of ships that vanished and fortunes lost to the deep. This single coin, a piece of 8, was a whisper from the past, a tiny key to a vault no one had opened in generations. The initial disbelief melted into a pulse of pure excitement. He knew this was not just treasure, it was a message, and that message would soon draw archaeologists from across the globe to this remote shore, beginning a meticulous search for the source of that one tantalizing clue. What they would eventually uncover on the seabed was far more than a scattered handful of coins. That single silver coin was a siren's call for science. Within weeks, Miguel's discovery had triggered a quiet but urgent mobilization. The local heritage department secured the site, understanding that this was not a matter for treasure hunters but for history. A specialized team began to assemble on the island's shore, a blend of expertise as unique as the find itself. There were marine archaeologists, their faces weathered by sun and salt, who could read the ocean floor like a book. Alongside them worked local historians, men and women who knew the island's oral traditions and old maps by heart. Even a conservationist joined, her job to preserve whatever fragile objects the sea might surrender. Their first task was to see what the human eye could not. They launched a small boat equipped with a magnetometer, a device that senses metallic objects buried in the seabed, and side-scan sonar, which paints a detailed acoustic picture of the bottom. As the boat made its slow, methodical passes, the instruments began to sing a story of their own. The readings did not show a random scattering. Instead, they revealed a distinct, concentrated debris field about the size of a city block. The pattern was unmistakable to the experts. It was the signature of a significant event, either the violent disintegration of a wooden ship or the deliberate, clustered dumping of a heavy cargo. This was no accidental loss of a coin purse overboard. This was a deposit. The anticipation on the research vessel was electric. Then the divers went down. In the hushed, blue-green world below, the first handheld finds began to emerge, each one a piece of the puzzle. More pieces of 8, of course, but also stranger, more personal objects. A corroded but still intricate brass divider, a navigator's tool for plotting courses on charts, was carefully lifted from the sand. They found the heavy, stone-like concretions that often form around iron objects, hiding what could be tools or weapons. And everywhere, nestled in the seabed, were dark, waterlogged fragments of timber, some still joined with ancient wooden pegs, the skeletal remains of the vessel that carried this cargo to its grave. Each artifact raised more questions than it answered. What ship was this, and why did its journey end here in this lonely spot? The real excavation began with a grid laid over the seabed, a system of strings and markers turning the mystery into a methodical science. Divers descended not with shovels, but with tools of delicate precision, handheld water dredges that gently vacuumed away centuries of sand and silt, and soft brushes that could clean an artifact with the care of a painter. Every scoop was watched, every cloud of sediment monitored, for a single coin could be lost forever in the murk. The first major shape to emerge from the gloom was both a dream and a logistical nightmare, a heavy wooden chest, its iron bands thick with rust but its form miraculously intact. It took a team of divers and a specially rigged lift bag to raise it with agonizing slowness to the surface, a process where one wrong move could see 300 years of history disintegrate into splinters. On the support barge, under a makeshift awning, conservators waited with trays of fresh water, ready to submerge the chest again to prevent the ancient wood from drying out and crumbling to dust. Inside, they found not a loose jumble, but an orderly stack of silver bars, each one stamped with the crest of the Spanish crown and a registry number, a bureaucratic record of imperial wealth now resting in a plastic tub. Nearby, the grid revealed another stunning cluster, a pyramid of silver coins fused together by corrosion into a single, heavy cake, the individual pieces of 8 now bonded by time and chemistry. Each find was a race against decay. A beautiful pewter plate, its surface etched with a family crest, looked solid until touched, whereupon it threatened to flex and crack like a wafer. Every fragment of timber, every nail and pottery shard was photographed in situ, given a numbered tag, and its exact location logged into a 3-dimensional digital map of the site. The thrill was palpable with every ping of the metal detector and every careful extraction, but it was a quiet, focused thrill, the slow, rewarding unraveling of a secret the ocean had guarded for generations. The sheer scale of the wealth began to materialize in the conservation lab. Laid out on long tables under the careful glow of examination lights was the complete inventory of a pirate's dream. The most numerous items by far were the Spanish silver coins, the legendary pieces of 8. Hundreds of them, each one roughly the size of an old British half-crown, were slowly revealing their details. Conservators used tiny dental tools and ultrasonic baths to gently remove the black silver sulfide corrosion, and as the crust fell away, the coins told their own story. Many bore the cross of the Jerusalem, might order on one side and the royal coat of arms of Spain on the other, a design unchanged for centuries. Others showed the busts of specific monarchs like King Philip IV, their profiles worn soft by countless hands and the relentless sea. Their value in the late 1600s was substantial. A single piece of 8 could buy a fine meal, a good shirt, or a night's lodging in a port tavern. In today's terms, just one of these coins, as a historical artifact, could be worth several $100s to a collector, but together they represented a fortune in raw historical silver. Then came the gold. Far rarer and more thrilling were the gold doubloons, each one a heavy, satisfying disc about the diameter of a modern bottle cap. These were minted in the New World in places like Mexico City, and their surfaces, once cleaned, shone with a deep, buttery luster. A single gold doubloon was worth roughly 16 silver pieces of 8, the salary of a skilled sailor for months. But the treasure was not just bullion, there was personal plunder too. Intricate pieces of jewelry emerged from the concretion, a gold ring set with a deep blue sapphire, its setting twisted into an elaborate floral pattern. A silver pendant, likely once worn around the neck of a wealthy merchant or a noblewoman, was engraved with a scene of the Madonna and Child, a starkly personal item amidst the impersonal stacks of currency. Perhaps most telling were the silver ingots, rough-looking bars about the length of a man's hand. Each was stamped with official assay marks, a serial number, the royal tax seal, and a fineness rating, proving they came directly from a Spanish crown smelter. This was not mined wealth, this was processed, bureaucratic, stolen imperial treasure. The total value was staggering. In the 17th century, this haul represented the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in purchasing power, enough to buy a large plantation or a fleet of merchant ships. In modern terms, the numismatic and historical value of such a complete, documented collection is almost incalculable, easily running into the tens of millions. Yet, for all its glitter, this catalogue of riches presented the archaeologists with their first real mystery. A fortune this vast, carefully gathered and transported, was never meant to be lost. Its presence on the seabed was an accident, a tragedy, or something far more deliberate. The treasure was here, but the story of why it was abandoned was still buried even deeper. The glittering hoard on the lab table was a question waiting to be answered. Whose treasure was this? To unlock that secret, the archaeologists had to become detectives, using the artifacts themselves as their primary witnesses. The coins provided the first crucial timeline. The majority of the silver pieces of 8 bore dates clustered in the late 1680s, with the most recent mint marks pointing squarely to the year 1690. This was a vital clue. It meant the treasure could not have been lost before that year, effectively closing the book on any ships that vanished earlier in the century. The silver ingots told an even more specific story. Each bar's stamped markings were like a shipping label, and when researchers cross-referenced them with surviving Spanish colonial archives, they traced a batch of them to a specific royal smeltery in Peru, likely loaded onto a treasure galleon in the port of Callao around 1691. So the loot had a provenance, a paper trail leading back to the heart of the Spanish Empire, but the ship itself told a different tale. The timber fragments recovered were not from a massive, high-sided galleon. Analysis revealed they came from a much smaller, sleeker vessel, likely a sloop or a brigantine. These were the sports cars of the 17th century seas, fast, agile, and shallow-drafted, perfect for navigating the tricky shoals of the Caribbean and for outrunning larger, heavier warships. This was not a Spanish treasure ship, it was the kind of ship that hunted them. The emerging picture was clear. This was a pirate's prize taken from a Spanish vessel and then transferred to their own faster, more nimble craft. So which pirate? The date narrowed the field significantly to the closing years of the Golden Age. 2 compelling theories rose to the surface. The first pointed to the infamous Captain William Kidd, who was actively hunting prizes in the Indian Ocean and Caribbean during this exact period. Historical records show Kidd captured a rich Armenian-owned vessel called the Quedagh Merchant in 1698, a haul that made him legend. Could this be part of that loot, hidden away as he sailed toward his eventual arrest and execution? The second theory looked to a less famous but equally audacious event: the capture of the Spanish treasure ship Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación y Desengaño by the pirate ship Resolution under Captain Robert Allison in 1699. That raid yielded a fortune remarkably similar in description to what was found. The evidence was building a compelling case, but to confirm any theory, they needed to find the one thing a pirate crew would never willingly leave behind. The real story was not in the glittering bars of silver, but in a small, waterlogged box tucked almost apologetically beneath them. It was the last item to be raised from the grid, a chest no larger than a modern shoebox, its wood swollen and black with age. Unlike the sturdy, iron-bound treasure chests, this one was made of a lighter wood, its lid secured not with a heavy lock, but with a simple, corroded brass clasp that had long since fused shut. The conservators treated it with the same meticulous care as everything else, but a different kind of anticipation filled the air. This box felt personal. After days of careful work to slowly dehydrate the wood and stabilize its structure, the conservator on duty finally, gently, pried the clasp free with a thin metal tool. The lid released with a soft sigh of trapped air, a 300-year-old breath. Inside, protected from the worst of the sea's ravages by the tight seal and the surrounding sediment, was not gold. The team leaned in, their faces illuminated by the bright examination lamp, and a collective, silent confusion settled over the room. Nestled on a bed of what was once fine cloth, now reduced to a dark, fibrous pulp, was a collection of objects that made no sense alongside a pirate's plunder. There was a small, hand-carved wooden figure, a saint or perhaps a sailor's votive offering, its features smoothed by handling. Next to it lay a bundle of thin, braided cord and a single, well-worn leather die. But it was the centerpiece that drew their eyes and held them. It was a surgeon's kit, the tools of a ship's doctor. Laid out on the stained fabric were a few rusted but recognizable instruments, a small saw for amputations, a probe, and several scalpels. This was a kit for saving lives, or more accurately, for attempting to save them under the most brutal conditions. The excitement of the treasure hunt evaporated, replaced by a solemn, heavy curiosity. Why would a pirate crew bury this humble, intimate collection with a king's ransom? What terrible event transpired that made a surgeon's tools and a child's toy worthy of the same careful interment as stolen silver? The treasure now had a human heartbeat, and with it came the first chilling whisper of the dark secret they had truly uncovered. Among the surgeon's tools lay a single coin that did not belong. It was not silver, nor was it gold. It was a dull, heavy disc of what appeared to be lead, slightly larger than a piece of 8 and far cruder in its craftsmanship. While the Spanish coins bore the crisp, regal stamps of royal mints, this object looked like it had been made by hand in a hurry. Its surface was pitted and uneven, and the markings stamped into it were deep, jagged, and deeply unsettling. On one side was a simple, stark skull, not the elaborate Jolly Rogers of later pirate flags, but a primitive, almost angry depiction. On the reverse was a symbol that made the historians exchange uneasy glances, a crude, 7-pointed star surrounded by a ring of what looked like drops or tears. This was no currency. It carried no king's face, no denomination, no mark of any empire that ever existed. It felt, as one conservator later said, like a whisper meant to be heard only in the dark. The initial theories tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a pirate's personal good luck token, a talisman carried into battle. Maybe it was a marker for a secret society, a way for brethren to identify one another in a crowded tavern. Some even suggested it was a gaming piece, a counter for a high-stakes card game played by lamplight. But none of these explanations felt complete. Good luck charms were usually worn, kept close to the body, not buried in a box with medical tools. Secret society tokens were often made of more precious metals, and a gaming piece would not be made of toxic, heavy lead. This object had a weight to it that went beyond mere metal, a purposeful, ominous aura that set it apart from everything else in the hoard. It was an anomaly, a deliberate piece of darkness placed among the treasure, and it became the first tangible clue that the crew's fate was tied to something far older and more fearful than a storm or a naval battle. That crude lead token sent a ripple far beyond the archaeology lab. To understand its message, experts from other fields were called in, historians of maritime folklore and symbologists who study the language of secret signs. Their task was to decode a warning from a world where the line between the physical and the supernatural was dangerously thin. The seven-pointed star, they explained, was a potent and ancient symbol, one that appeared in contexts as diverse as medieval alchemy and early navigation charts. For some, it represented the 7 classical planets known at the time, a map of the cosmos. For others, particularly in certain West African spiritual traditions carried across the Atlantic by enslaved people, similar star patterns held protective or ritual significance, a means of harnessing spiritual power. Could a pirate, perhaps himself once enslaved or in contact with those traditions, have adopted it? The skull, of course, was clearer, the universal emblem of mortality. But in this context, it was less a pirate flag and more a direct statement: you are dead if you touch this. Historical records began to offer chilling parallels. There were accounts, though often shrouded in tavern tales, of pirates using specific, ritualized marks to protect their buried hoards. Some captains were said to perform elaborate ceremonies over their chests, invoking dark forces or placing curses upon the gold to strike down any who took it without their blessing. This was not mere superstition, it was a practical psychological weapon. In a world without banks or police, a curse was a powerful security system, a story that would travel through every port and deter greedy hands. The token, then, might have been a physical anchor for such a curse, a manufactured object charged with intent and buried as a spiritual tripwire. The theory of a Freemason-like pirate code also held weight, brotherhoods bound by secret oaths and shared symbols. Yet this mark felt different, less about fraternity and more about fatal consequence. It connected this specific treasure to the deepest fears of the age, the idea that some wealth came with a spiritual price, that the ocean's depths held not just silver but souls bound to guard it. The loot, it seemed, was protected by a shield far stronger than a locked chest, the terrifying power of a story. The lead token was a warning, but the paper held the confession. In a separate crate, nestled among broken pottery and ballast stones, the divers found a sodden, blackened mass. At first glance, it was just a lump of seabed detritus, but a careful touch revealed a different texture, a fibrous softness that hinted at its true nature. It was a book, or what remained of one, its leather binding long since eaten away, its pages fused into a single, brick-like block by centuries of pressure and salt. This was the most fragile artifact of all, a puzzle that threatened to dissolve into pulp if handled with anything less than absolute reverence. The entire block was transported to a specialized lab where conservators faced a task as delicate as brain surgery. Their first step was to slowly, patiently rehydrate the paper, bathing the block in a series of controlled chemical baths designed to replace the destructive salts with stabilizing compounds. This process took weeks, with the team monitoring the pH and temperature daily, watching for any sign of disintegration. Once stabilized, the real magic began. Using fine misters and tools no thicker than a human hair, they began the agonizingly slow work of separating one parchment leaf from another. Each page was a fraction of a millimeter thick, and the ink, iron gall in nature, had bled and faded but left a ghostly impression. Under multispectral imaging lights invisible to the human eye, Those faint brown stains bloomed into legible script. The words that emerged were not from an official ship's log, but from a personal journal, its entries scrawled in a hurried, often desperate hand. The deciphered passages were chilling. One early entry, dated simply June, spoke of a triumphant chase and capture, the writing exuberant. The Spaniard yielded a king's feast in silver. The men's eyes are bright with fortune, but the tone soon darkens. A later page, its edges burned as if held too close to a candle, contains a line that made the researchers pause. The quartermaster insists the usual tithe is not enough, speaks of a deeper bargain struck to calm the sea itself. A price, he says, will be paid later. Then the entries become medical. J. Turner took to his hammock this morning, fevered and speaking of shadows in the corner. No mark upon him. The next day, 2 more men down with the same shaking sickness. The surgeon is perplexed. The final legible entry is the most haunting. Just 3 broken sentences at the bottom of a page, the ink blotted as if the writer's hand was unsteady. The gold feels heavy in the hand. A silence has fallen over the ship, broken only by the coughs from below deck. We make for the island tomorrow to bury it all. And then nothing. The following pages are blank, water-damaged voids. The journal and the voice within it simply stops. This was not just an inventory of treasure. It was a chronicle of a curse unfolding in real time. A captain watching his crew and his own luck unravel from the moment the stolen wealth came aboard. The final legible entry in the journal is dated only the last day of July. The handwriting here is a frantic scrawl, the letters slanting wildly and digging deep into the parchment, as if the quill was being driven by a shaking hand. It reads, "The quartermaster has gathered the last of the able men. They say the gold is poisoned, that we took it from a consecrated hold meant for a church's ransom. He says we must give it all back to the deep, bury it with a binding oath, or the sickness will follow us onto the very land. We are to swear on the lead token, a thing he brought from the Guinea coast, that we will never speak of this place or this cargo again. To break the oath is to invite the shadow back. May God or whatever darker thing listens have mercy on our silent souls." The entry simply ends there, the last word trailing into a blot of ink that looks like a drop of blood. Historians have pored over these lines for years. Some argue it is a literal account of a panicked crew, convinced they have stolen cursed ecclesiastical treasure, and now bargaining with a spiritual object from West African tradition in a desperate act of hybrid ritual. Others see it as a brilliant, if terrifying, piece of social control, a story concocted by a cunning quartermaster to prevent mutiny over the division of the spoils, using fear to enforce unity and secrecy. Could it be the ravings of a fever dream, the product of a mind addled by illness and guilt? The evidence suggests otherwise. The very act of carefully boxing the surgeon's tools and the lead token, of burying them with the treasure, shows a deliberate, ritualistic follow-through. This was not a discarded rumor, it was a performed belief. That final entry is the crew's own voice explaining the dark secret, not of a ghost or a monster, but of a profound collective terror they embedded into the seabed alongside their fortune. They did not just hide treasure, they attempted to quarantine a curse. The journal's final, terrified words were a confession of fear, but the land itself would soon provide evidence of a far more final silence. Months after the main underwater excavation concluded, a team surveying the nearest island for any related artifacts made the discovery that changed everything. On a secluded, rocky stretch of beach shielded from view by a thick grove of mangroves, their ground-penetrating radar pinged with an anomaly. It was not the dense signal of metal, but the softer, hollow signature of disturbed earth. What they carefully unearthed, there was not a chest of coins, but a shallow, unmarked pit, and within it lay human bones. This was not a shipwreck burial, where bodies are often found together in the wreckage. This was something else entirely. The remains of 7 individuals were interred in a haphazard, crowded fashion, as if placed there in desperate haste. There was no sign of a shroud, no personal effects, not even the simple wooden marker sailors would often carve for their fallen comrades. They had been buried in the sand just above the tide line, a lonely and ignoble end a world away from a proper Christian grave. The initial assumption was tragedy, perhaps the surviving crew, sick and starving, succumbing one by one on this desolate shore. But when forensic anthropologists examined the bones, that theory shattered. The skeletons told a story the journal had only hinted at. Several of the individuals showed clear signs of peri-mortem trauma, meaning injuries sustained at or around the time of death. One skull had a severe, depressed fracture on the back of the cranium, consistent with a blow from a heavy, blunt object like a ship's belaying pin or a rock. Another set of wrist bones bore deep, parallel grooves, the unmistakable mark of having been tightly bound with rough cord for a long period. Most chillingly, the bodies were not laid to rest in any traditional position. They were oriented in a rough circle, their feet pointing inward toward the center of the pit, where archaeologists found only a single, empty conch shell. This was not a random arrangement. This was a placement, a configuration that spoke of intention, not accident. The evidence painted a grim and inescapable picture. These men did not die of fever or thirst alone. They met a violent end on this beach, some possibly restrained, their bodies then arranged in a manner that suggests a ritual, a final act performed by those who survived them. The treasure's dark secret was no longer just a story of spiritual dread written in a journal. It was now a physical fact etched in bone, transforming the mystery from one of cursed gold to one of profound human betrayal and desperate, perhaps murderous ceremony. The bones on that lonely beach had a story to tell, and it was a forensic anthropologist named Dr. Elena Vance who became their interpreter. In her laboratory, far from the salt air, the skeletons were laid out under bright lights, each one a silent archive of a life lived hard and a death met violently. Her first task was to establish who these men were, and the answer lay not in their pockets, but in their very teeth and bones. She took minute samples for isotope analysis, a process that reads the chemical signatures locked inside us from the food and water we consume as children. The results were a map of the 17th century world. One individual's isotopes pointed unequivocally to the west coast of Africa. Another's signature matched the highlands of Scotland. A third showed markers consistent with someone who grew up in the coastal regions of the Caribbean itself, perhaps a sailor of mixed European and indigenous ancestry. This was the crew manifest no paper had preserved, a snapshot of a pirate band's brutal democracy, men drawn from across the globe by desperation or ambition, united only by the ship they sailed and the treasure they stole. But how did this international brotherhood meet its end? Dr. Vance's tools moved over the bones, searching for the final chapter. She found no clean sword cuts to ribs, no telltale lead ball fractures in the skulls from musket fire. The violence here was more intimate, more chaotic. The blunt force trauma to one man's skull was the work of something heavy and close. The deep grooves on another's wrist bones spoke of captivity, of being bound tightly for days, maybe weeks, as events unfolded. Most critically, she examined the edges of the fractures under magnification. The bone had not healed, not even a little, confirming these injuries happened at the very moment of death. This was not a crew that fought a naval battle and later succumbed to wounds. This was a crew that met violence on dry land on that very beach. The timeline became the most chilling deduction. The bodies were buried in sand that showed no signs of a prolonged camp, no hearths, no discarded tools from building shelters. They were placed directly in the ground, still wearing the clothes hinted at by rusted button fragments. Crucially, their grave was shallow, hastily dug, and positioned just above the high tide line, a location chosen for speed, not sanctity. All the forensic evidence pointed to one terrible conclusion: these men were killed shortly after the treasure was secured in its seabed vault. The ritualistic placement of the bodies, feet inward around that empty conch shell, suggests their deaths were not a random act of madness, but a final, dreadful part of the ceremony the journal described. Perhaps they were the sacrifice, the price the quartermaster warned would be paid later, a permanent silencing to bind the curse and protect the secret. Or perhaps they were the last believers, the ones who insisted on the oath, executed by those who thought the curse a fiction and wanted no loose ends. The bones do not say which, they only testify with silent, brutal clarity that for this crew, the treasure was not a gateway to freedom, but a seed that grew a harvest of betrayal and blood on a forgotten shore. Buried at the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in a salt-stained scrap of velvet, was the object that made the archaeologist's blood run cold. It was not a coin or a bar. It was a small, heavy statue, no taller than a man's hand, carved from a single piece of obsidian. The volcanic glass was polished to a sinister, mirror-like blackness that seemed to swallow the light. The figure it depicted was unmistakable, a hunching, skeletal entity with a gaping mouth and hollow eyes, its form a fusion of human and bat. To the experts, this was no generic trinket. The style was pure Mesoamerican, likely from the Maya civilization, and it represented a deity of the underworld, a lord of darkness and death. Such objects were never meant for trade or display. They were sacred votive offerings placed in the deepest tombs or the most secluded temple sanctums to honor gods of the afterlife. For a Spanish conquistador to have looted this from a royal burial site was an act of profound sacrilege. For a pirate to then steal it from the Spaniard compounded the transgression. This was not merely stolen wealth, it was a kidnapped god, a piece of a spiritual world violently ripped from its context and now trapped in a chest of silver. Its presence transformed the entire nature of the hoard. The crew hadn't just intercepted a shipment of minted coins and taxed silver bars. They had inadvertently taken possession of something an entire civilization believed was charged with the essence of the underworld itself. The lead token's skull and star now made a terrible kind of sense. It was not a pirate's invention, but a desperate, hybrid attempt to contain a foreign and terrifying spiritual force they did not understand. The forbidden artifact was the dark heart of the secret, the reason why the quartermaster spoke of a deeper bargain, and why the crew felt a sickness clinging to the gold. They weren't just rich men, they were men who believed they were carrying a curse made solid, a piece of a tomb sailing with them across the open sea. That obsidian figure was a key to a door no pirate was ever meant to open. To understand the true weight of what they carried, the archaeologists knew they needed to go beyond their own field. They brought in cultural historians and specialists in Mesoamerican art, experts who could read the language of stone. The statue was placed under high-resolution photography and three-dimensional scanning, its every curve and angle compared to known artifacts in museum collections across the globe. The consensus was swift and chilling. The style was definitively late classic Maya, likely originating from the dense jungles of what is now Guatemala or southern Mexico. More specifically, the depiction of a skeletal, bat-like deity pointed to a god known as Camazotz, a figure deeply associated with night, sacrifice, and the underworld. This was not a decorative piece for a noble's home. Statues like this one served a singular, powerful purpose. They were placed in royal burial chambers or deep within cave systems considered portals to Xibalba, the Maya realm of the dead. Their role was to guard the sacred space, to act as a conduit for the spirit of the departed, and to warn off the living. To remove such an object was to violate the most fundamental covenant between the physical and spiritual worlds. It was an act that, in the Maya worldview, would not go unanswered. The curse was not a vague superstition, it was a predictable consequence, a spiritual law as real to them as gravity. The Spanish conquistador who first looted it from a tomb had already triggered that consequence. The pirate who then took it from the Spanish galleon was not just a thief, he became the latest link in a chain of profound desecration. This contextualizes the crew's mounting dread not as irrational fear, but as a dawning recognition. They weren't suffering bad luck, they were holding a piece of a tomb, an object designed to commune with death itself, and they were sailing with it into the heart of the open ocean. Their world, steeped in Christian imagery and sailors' omens, had no framework for this. The quartermaster's lead token, possibly informed by West African spiritual traditions that also respected powerful object-based magic, may have been a frantic attempt to build a new spiritual cage for a force they could not name. The treasure was poisoned not by chemistry but by history. Every piece of silver in that chest was now shadowed by the silent, obsidian guardian at its heart, a stolen god demanding a price that would be paid not in coin but in silence and blood. The obsidian god from the jungle and the bones on the beach were not the final pieces of this story. To find them, the archaeologists had to look beyond their tools and into the living memory of the island itself. While the scientists had been focused on the seabed, a quiet parallel investigation was happening on shore. A young historian from the heritage team, Maria, began to visit the oldest fishing villages, not with a metal detector, but with a notebook and a respectful ear. She sat on weathered porches with men and women whose families had lived on this coast for centuries, sharing coffee and asking not about treasure, but about old stories, the kind told to children to keep them from wandering too far. At first, the elders were hesitant, polite but closed. The word treasure brought a wary look, a sense of outsiders coming to take things. But when Maria asked instead about the bay itself, about places that felt different, or tales from their own grandparents, the silence began to soften. One evening, an old fisherman named Raphael, his face a map of sun and salt, finally spoke. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the very cove where the dive boats were anchored. "We have a name for that water," he said. "We call it La Caleta del Silencio, the Cove of Silence." His grandfather called it that, and his grandfather before him. The story was always the same. Long ago, when his grandfather was a boy, a ship came in the night, not with lights but dark. Men worked on the beach, but they did not laugh or shout. They worked like ghosts in complete quiet. Then they sailed away at dawn, but the ship never cleared the horizon. It was said they left something behind in the water, something that demanded quiet. Raphael explained that the local fishermen for generations would avoid dropping nets in that specific cove. It was not that the fishing was bad, he said, it was that the fish there were different. They would sometimes pull up catches with milky, blind eyes, as if they had been living in total darkness. The story was told to children as a warning: do not take from the silent cove, for what you take will take from you. This was not a legend of glittering gold, but of a profound, ingrained taboo. In another village, an elderly woman named Isabella shared a fragment of a song, a lullaby her mother used to sing. It spoke of hombres pálidos con oro frío, pale men with cold gold, who pagaron con su risa, paid with their laughter. The song said they buried their joy with their treasure, and that on certain still nights you could hear not ghosts but the absence of sound, a hollow quiet where the waves themselves seemed to hesitate. These oral histories, passed down for over 300 years, held no precise coordinates or pirate names, yet they preserved the core truth of the archaeological find, a memory of a silent, traumatic event, of men who worked under a shroud of dread and left behind a legacy of unease. The scientific evidence described a ritual with a lead token and an obsidian idol, but the local legend called it a curse on a quiet bay. Both were describing the same dark secret, one through the language of objects, the other through the poetry of fear. The gap between the artifact and the folk tale was not a contradiction, it was a confirmation. The secret had never been fully lost, only translated, carried across the centuries, not in a chest, but in a warning whispered from one generation to the next, a testament to the deep scar such an event can leave upon a place and its people. The details of the old fisherman's story were not vague superstitions. They were a checklist. When the historian Maria pressed gently, asking Raphael if the old tale mentioned anything specific about the men who worked in the silent cove. His answer was precise. He said his grandfather's version always spoke of 7 shadows on the beach. Not 5, not 10, but 7. This number sent a chill through the research team, for it matched exactly the number of skeletons found in the mass grave. The legend also held that these men did not speak because they could not, that a quiet sickness had taken their voices and left them only with trembling hands. This eerie description aligns hauntingly with the journal's final entries describing a feverish malaise that left the crew coughing and shadowed. Most strikingly, Raphael recounted that the men were said to have placed something small and dark into the chest before it sank, an ojo de la noche, or eye of the night, to watch over it. This could very well be a folk memory of the obsidian statue, that dark, watchful god from the underworld. The local lore did not preserve the pirates' names or the ship's flag, but it captured the emotional and physical core of the trauma, the number of the dead, the nature of their strange ailment, and the presence of a ritually significant object. This convergence is not a coincidence. It is powerful evidence that the dark secret is real. The events of that desperate week were so shocking, so outside the norm of even a violent pirate's life, that they burned themselves into the memory of the place. Witnesses, perhaps children hiding in the mangroves or fishermen watching from a distance, carried the story home. Stripped of the specific context of Spanish gold and Maya idols, the tale was distilled into its most potent elements: fear, silence, and a fatal price, and passed down as a warning. For 3 centuries, science had no way to verify this whispered legend. Now, the forensic data and the waterlogged journal have provided a startling translation. The bones confirm the number 7, the journal describes the sickness, the artifacts reveal the ritual, the legend was the echo, and archaeology has finally found the source of the sound. This means the story was never just a story. It was a community's way of processing and remembering a real, localized horror, preserving the truth in the language of myth until the day someone would come to listen. Every piece of evidence now clicks into place with a dreadful finality. We have the stolen obsidian god, a sacred guardian of death ripped from a Maya tomb. We have the terrified journal entries speaking of a sickness and a price to be paid. We have the 7 skeletons killed and buried in a ritual circle on that lonely beach. And we have the 300-year-old local legend of silent men and a cursed cove. When you synthesize these fragments, a single, sinister theory emerges as the most compelling explanation for the dark secret. It begins with an act of profound sacrilege. The pirates, likely after capturing a Spanish galleon, discovered among the mundane silver bars a crate containing the obsidian statue. To them, it was just a curious, darkly beautiful object, another piece of plunder. But they had unknowingly taken something far more dangerous than gold. In the worldview of the people who created it, this artifact was a direct link to the underworld, a spiritual entity bound to a specific sacred place. Removing it was an offense that demanded retribution. This, the theory suggests, is the true source of the curse. It was not a magical spell, but a chain of consequences set in motion by violating a deep cultural and spiritual law. The crew's mounting misfortunes, the strange sickness, the growing paranoia, these were not coincidences. They were, in the minds of the sailors, the manifesting wrath of a foreign god they had offended. The quartermaster, perhaps a man exposed to West African or other spiritual traditions that took such forces seriously, recognized this. He interpreted the chaos not as bad luck, but as a spiritual crisis requiring a spiritual solution. This is where the theory takes its darkest turn. The lead token, with its skull and 7-pointed star, was likely his creation, a talisman intended to bind or contain the angry force within the statue. The ritual on the beach, culminating in the burial of the 7 men, was the terrible price. Perhaps these 7 were the most afflicted by the sickness, sacrificed in a desperate attempt to appease the entity and quarantine the curse with the treasure. Or perhaps they were the last true believers in the quartermaster's grim ritual, murdered by the rest of the crew who saw the ceremony as madness and wanted to erase all witnesses before fleeing. The bodies arranged in a circle, feet pointing inward, was the final act of that ceremony, a permanent seal on the pact. They buried the treasure, the statue, the surgeon's tools, and the token together, performing an oath of silence they believed was enforced by supernatural consequence. Then the survivors sailed away, carrying the guilt and the fear, but never the wealth they had killed for. The local legend of the Cove of Silence is the enduring echo of that week of terror, a community's memory of witnessing a tragedy so stark it became a permanent warning in their folklore. This theory paints a haunting portrait of greed colliding with a world of older, deeper beliefs, where stolen wealth carried a hidden spiritual cost that ultimately demanded payment in blood and silence. The silence that fell over the Cove of Silence was not the end of the story for the pirates who created it. To understand their fate, we must leave the artifacts and the island behind and step into the dusty archives of history, searching for a crew that vanished from the records as completely as their treasure vanished from the light. The timeline is our only guide. The coins and ingots point to a theft no earlier than the year 1691. The hurried burial and the grim events on the beach likely occurred within a year or two of that, placing us squarely in the final, desperate years of the 17th century. This was a time when the Golden Age of Piracy was beginning to crack under pressure. The great European empires, weary of the constant theft, were finally turning their powerful navies toward hunting pirates down. The seas were becoming less a lawless frontier and more a patrolled highway, and the noose was tightening for every captain still flying the black flag. So what became of our crew? Did they simply sail into a storm and sink, a tragic but ordinary end for sailors of that era? Maritime logs from the period show no record of a significant, unidentified shipwreck in that immediate region around 1692 or 93. A storm is possible, but it feels too neat, too impersonal for the cursed narrative they themselves seem to believe in. A more plausible and darker possibility is mutiny. Imagine the scene aboard that ship after they left the island. The treasure is gone, buried under a ritual they barely understood. 7 of their comrades are dead by their own hands. The air is thick with guilt, paranoia, and the lingering fear of the sickness. In such a pressurized environment, it would take only a single accusation, one man blaming another for their cursed luck, for violence to erupt. A bloody fight on the decks, the winners tossing the losers overboard, is a grimly common epilogue in pirate histories. The survivors, now a tiny, traumatized band, might have limped into a distant port only to be arrested by authorities who had been hunting their ship for months. Yet the historical record holds another, more specific clue. In the Admiralty Court papers from Port Royal, Jamaica, dated to the spring of 1694, there is a brief, chilling entry. It documents the trial and hanging of 5 men, captured aboard a small, unnamed sloop found drifting off the Cayman Islands. The ship was nearly empty of supplies and carried no cargo of any value. The men, described as ragged and sun-crazed, offered no coherent defense. They simply repeated to the bewilderment of the court that they were already dead men, and that the quiet had followed them from a bay with no name. They were executed as pirates and buried in an unmarked grave. The number 5 is telling. If our original crew was, say, 25 strong and 7 were killed on the island, that would leave 18. A mutiny or further disaster at sea could easily whittle that number down to a final, broken handful of 5. Their story of being already dead and pursued by the quiet aligns perfectly with the psychological trauma of the ritual and the local legend of the Cove of Silence. Whether by storm, mutiny, or the hangman's rope, the historical trail consistently leads to a grim collective end. Not a single member of that crew appears to have enjoyed their stolen fortune or died peacefully in bed. This universal silence, this absence of any survivor's tale of riches, is the final piece of the curse's legacy. It suggests the dark secret did not remain buried with the treasure. It sailed away with them, a silent passenger on a ship doomed to never find a safe port, ensuring that the creators of the secret would be its final victims. The discovery of the dark secret did not end with the last journal entry or the final forensic report. It echoed powerfully into the present, shaping the lives and decisions of everyone who touched this story. For the archaeologists and divers on the team, the initial thrill of uncovering treasure was gradually overshadowed by a palpable collective unease. In off-camera interviews, several team members confessed to a shared sensation they struggled to explain. It was not fear of ghosts, they insisted, but a profound, heavy stillness that seemed to permeate the dive site, especially when handling the personal artifacts. One conservator described working late in the lab with the surgeon's tools, feeling an irrational but intense need to turn on every light in the room. The lead marine archaeologist, a man with decades of experience on shipwrecks, admitted he had never felt such a strong urge to finish an excavation quickly and leave a site behind. The most commonly reported phenomenon was auditory, a recurring experience among the divers of hearing distorted voices or muffled shouts through their communication gear when no one was speaking, followed by bursts of static that technicians could never trace to a source. These modern reactions were not superstition, but a human response to the overwhelming narrative of trauma they were physically uncovering, a psychological weight transferred across centuries through objects steeped in fear. This unease translated directly into complex ethical and legal battles the moment the treasure was brought ashore. The immediate question was one of ownership. Under international maritime law, a find in territorial waters typically belongs to the nation-state, in this case, the Caribbean government where the island was located. But the local fishermen who found the first coin argued for a finder's reward, a standard practice in salvage. The debate grew more intense when the cultural origin of the obsidian statue was confirmed. Representatives from Maya descendant communities in Guatemala and Mexico filed formal claims, stating that this was not treasure, but a sacred funerary object, a kidnapped ancestor that needed to be returned to its spiritual home. They argued that the statue's presence cursed the entire hoard, making it spiritually toxic and legally distinct from simple bullion. For them, repatriation was not a political request, but a moral and spiritual necessity to heal a historical wrong. The government faced a dilemma: hold onto a priceless collection that could anchor a national museum, or honor a profound cultural claim and set a precedent. The finders, caught in the middle, saw their potential fortune becoming a focal point for an international heritage dispute, a modern consequence of a 300-year-old theft. The resolution was as unprecedented as the find itself. After 2 years of tense negotiations, a unique agreement was reached. The vast majority of the treasure, the silver coins and ingots, remained the property of the island nation. They would form the centerpiece of a new museum dedicated to maritime history, with a significant portion of the revenue funding local education and conservation projects. The personal artifacts, the surgeon's kit, the journal, and the lead token were placed in a university archive for ongoing study. But the heart of the dark secret, the obsidian statue of Camazotz, was treated differently. In a quiet, deeply respectful ceremony attended by government officials, archaeologists, and Maya spiritual leaders, the statue was formally repatriated. It was not treated as a museum piece to be displayed. Following the guidance of the descendant communities, it was taken to a secure, undisclosed location in the Guatemalan highlands, believed to be near its original region, for a private ritual of reinterment. The goal was to spiritually deconsecrate the object and finally lay its restless power to rest, breaking the chain of desecration that began on a pirate ship. This act acknowledged that some values transcend monetary worth, and that the true closing of this mystery required addressing the original sin at its core. The treasure's impact today proves that the past is never truly buried. It waits for the present to decide whether to repeat its mistakes or to finally make things right. Not every historian or archaeologist hears whispers of curses in the evidence. For every researcher who sees a ritual sacrifice in the beach grave, there is another who sees a far more mundane, yet equally brutal reality. This rational perspective insists we view the pirates not as victims of a supernatural force, but as authors of their own tragic, all-too-human fate. From this viewpoint, the entire dark secret unravels into a series of unfortunate but explainable events, stripped of any ghostly intervention. The lead token with its skull and star, they argue, is almost certainly a gaming piece, a simple counter used in a high-stakes dice game below deck. Gambling was rampant on pirate ships, a primary form of entertainment, and homemade tokens were common. The seven-pointed star was likely just a decorative flourish, not an arcane sigil. The terrified logbook entries, these skeptics suggest, are not a literal chronicle of a spreading spiritual sickness, but the metaphorical ravings of a captain watching his command disintegrate from very real causes. The shadow the men spoke of could have been the early delirium of malaria or yellow fever, diseases carried by mosquitoes in the Caribbean that would have been utterly mysterious to a 17th-century crew. The silence that fell over the ship was probably the grim, demoralizing quiet of men who were simply sick, exhausted, and terrified of the punishment awaiting them if caught. The mass grave on the beach loses its ritualistic aura under this scrutiny. These historians point out that violence was the currency of pirate life. The 7 men could have been killed in a mutiny over the division of the spoils that turned bloody, or executed by their own captain for attempted theft or insubordination. Their circular burial might not be ceremonial at all, but merely the fastest way for a small, hurried group to dig a single pit and dispose of several bodies at once. The empty conch shell in the center could be a coincidence washed in by the tide after the fact. Even the obsidian statue, the so-called forbidden artifact, is demystified. To a pirate, it was not a terrifying god of the underworld. It was a fantastically rare and beautifully crafted object, a curio of immense monetary and artistic value. They would have seen it as the ultimate trophy, a prize stolen from the Spanish who had themselves stolen it from a conquered people. Its spiritual significance would have been irrelevant if it was even known to them at all. The ultimate argument from this camp is the simplest and perhaps the most powerful. Piracy was a lethally dangerous profession. Ships sank in storms. Crews mutinied, men died of scurvy, infection, and combat. The statistical likelihood of any given pirate crew meeting a violent or untimely end was extraordinarily high. Therefore, this crew's disappearance is not an anomaly, it is the standard conclusion. Their story is not one of a curse, but of the relentless, grinding peril of life outside the law on the unforgiving sea. This perspective challenges us to separate the compelling poetry of a curse from the stark prose of history, asking whether we are hearing a ghost story from the past or simply the echo of ordinary human desperation amplified by time. History may have given us the artifacts, but it has stubbornly kept the names to itself. We can reconstruct the terror, the ritual, and the final betrayal, yet the central characters in this drama remain frustratingly anonymous. Who exactly were these men? The isotope analysis gave us their childhood homes, a map of desperate origins, but not a single journal entry contains a full name, only an initial. Was the captain a disgraced naval officer, a former privateer like Henry Morgan whose letter of marque had expired? Or was he a common sailor who seized his chance during a mutiny and rose to command through sheer force of will? The quartermaster, that ominous figure who spoke of deeper bargains and produced the lead token, is the most compelling ghost of all. Was he a man of learning, someone who had traveled to the Guinea coast or the Caribbean islands and absorbed spiritual practices that seemed to offer power? Or was he simply a cunning manipulator, using fear as a tool to control a crew on the brink of chaos? We have their bones, their tools, and their fear, but we do not have their voices. They are silhouettes against a stormy sky, defined only by the shadow they cast. This anonymity feeds directly into the second, and perhaps greatest, lingering mystery. We have labeled it the dark secret, but what imprecise, actionable detail was it? We know there was a ritual. The circular grave, the empty conch shell, the careful burial of the surgeon's kit, and the token all point to a performed ceremony. But what words were spoken? What specific acts beyond the violence we see in the bones were carried out on that beach? Was it a sacrifice, an offering to the obsidian statue in a futile attempt to send the stolen god back to its realm? Or was it a binding oath, a collective swearing on the token to never speak of the location, sealed with the blood of the seven to make the pact unbreakable? The journal hints, but it does not describe. The dark secret is not the treasure's location. It is the precise nature of that final, terrible transaction between the living and whatever they believed was listening. That knowledge died with the participants, leaving us only with the chilling aftermath and a gap in the story that our imagination rushes to fill with the worst possibilities. And what of the others? The forensic evidence tells us 7 men died on the beach. Historical fragments suggest a handful more may have been hanged in Port Royal. But a pirate ship needed a crew of at least 20 and often many more. So where is the rest of the crew? Did they perish in a separate, unrecorded mutiny at sea, their ship scuttled and lost to a different patch of ocean? Could a smaller group have escaped entirely, slipping into the anonymous ports of the Caribbean to live out their days in paranoid silence, forever jumping at shadows and starting at the sound of the wind? The absence of any survivor's tale, any boastful deathbed confession or map passed down through a family, is in itself a powerful clue. It suggests that those who left the island either did not live long enough to tell the story, or were so traumatized by it that they vowed never to speak its name, a vow they kept for the rest of their lives. Their silence is a void that echoes. Finally, the physical landscape itself whispers of more secrets. The excavation recovered 1 chest, 1 cluster of coins, 1 set of artifacts. But is that all there is? The magnetometer readings showed a debris field, but could there be another chest, perhaps buried deeper under the sand, that they missed? The local legend speaks only of a single silent event, but history is rarely so neat. Could there be other, shallower graves on that island or a neighboring cay, holding the bodies of men who died later of their sickness or wounds? The ocean floor is a vast, shifting archive, and it is entirely possible that the main treasure vault was found, but that smaller caches, personal stashes hidden by individual pirates, still lie undiscovered in the coral or the mangrove roots. The discovery answered many questions, but in doing so, it opened the door to new ones, proving that a mystery 300 years in the making does not surrender all its truths at once. This is the enduring nature of pirate history and of archaeology itself. It is a puzzle where the final pieces are often lost to time, water, and deliberate silence. We can follow the evidence to the edge of the cliff, but we cannot always see what lies in the fog below. Some secrets are so dark, so bound up in trauma and fear, that they resist full revelation. They leave us with a collection of haunting objects, a bone-deep sense of dread, and a list of questions that may never have answers. And perhaps that is the most authentic legacy of this crew, not a definitive ending, but an eternal, unsettling echo across the centuries. Perhaps the true treasure here is not the silver, but the story itself. Why does a 300-year-old tale of greed and dread hold such power over us? The answer lies in a deep, almost primal human fascination. We are captivated by the archetype of buried treasure, the promise of a shortcut to a new life, of wealth lying just beneath the surface, waiting for a map and a brave heart. But layer onto that a curse, a dark secret, and the narrative becomes irresistible. It speaks to a fundamental tension within us, the clash between our boundless ambition and our instinct for self-preservation. The promise of immense wealth pulls us forward, while the threat of mortal danger, of a spiritual or physical cost, whispers for us to turn back. This combination triggers a narrative as old as storytelling itself, a cautionary tale about the price of desire. We see it in the legends of King Midas, whose golden touch came with a terrible loneliness. We hear it in the modern whispers surrounding the Hope Diamond, a gem of breathtaking beauty trailed by stories of misfortune for its owners. Most famously, we witnessed it with the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, where the sudden deaths of several expedition members were sensationalized as the curse of the pharaohs, a supernatural punishment for disturbing sacred rest. These stories endure not because we necessarily believe in magic, but because they externalize a very real internal conflict. They give form to our anxiety that success might come with hidden strings, that good fortune might be balanced by a later tragedy. The pirate loot with its dark secret fits perfectly into this ancient mold. It allows us to safely explore the thrill of the hunt and the terror of consequence from the comfort of our own time. We can marvel at the fortune, shudder at the ritual, and ponder the fate of the crew, all while engaging in a timeless mental exercise, weighing what we want against what we are willing to risk to get it. This story captivates because it is, at its core, a mirror. It reflects our own complicated relationship with luck, morality, and the haunting question of whether some doors, once opened, can ever truly be closed. That single glint of silver in a fisherman's net opened a door to a world of shadows. We followed the trail from the ocean floor to the forensic lab, from a waterlogged journal to a lonely beach grave, and from a stolen obsidian god to a 300-year-old village legend. The journey revealed more than a pirate's hoard. It uncovered a chilling narrative of human desperation. We saw the stacked silver bars, the gold doubloons, and the personal plunder. We deciphered the terrified journal entries and examined the bones of 7 men buried in a silent, ritual circle. We held the lead token and the obsidian statue, objects charged with fear and sacred power. Together, these pieces form a sinister and compelling theory, not of ghostly curses but of a tangible, human-made horror. A crew, believing they had offended a foreign god by stealing its idol, descended into paranoia and sickness. In a final, dreadful act, they performed a ritual sacrifice or execution on that beach, burying their comrades alongside the surgeon's tools and the token in a desperate attempt to quarantine the evil they felt they had unleashed. They sealed their oath with blood and silence, a dark secret they carried to their own grim ends. The millions in recovered treasure, while staggering, is ultimately not the point of this story. The true value of this discovery is the profound historical truth it forced into the light. It reminds us with stark clarity that the past is not a collection of inert dates and dusty objects. It is a living tapestry woven from the threads of real human lives, their deepest beliefs, their terrible crimes, and the inescapable consequences that followed. Sometimes the greatest value in digging up the past is learning what we should have had the wisdom to leave buried. So our journey through the Cove of Silence has reached its end, but the conversation is far from over. I want to thank you sincerely for sailing alongside me on this deep dive into one of history's most chilling pirate tales. The artifacts have been catalogued, the theories laid out, but the final verdict rests with you. Down in the comments, I am genuinely curious to hear your own thoughts on this dark secret. Do you find yourself convinced by the ritual sacrifice theory that a terrified crew paid a bloody price to appease a stolen god? Or does the rational, human explanation of mutiny and disease feel more compelling? Share your perspective, your own theories, and let's keep the mystery alive. If you enjoyed unraveling this enigma with me, please consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell. It truly helps this channel continue to explore the world's greatest historical puzzles, bringing you stories where the past refuses to stay quiet. Until next time, may your treasure be plentiful and your secrets stay safely buried, fair winds.